What the f do architects actually do? Surely it doesn't take 6 months to draw some lines on a piece of paper. What's going on, guys? My name's Tomic and welcome back to the channel. Today we are breaking down exactly what an architect does from start to finish, and believe it or not, it is a lot more than just draw 2D lines on a piece of paper. So I've spent a significant amount of time putting this video together, putting this very detailed flowchart, I'll call it, together, which I actually used in practice to train some of our grads. It is a fundamental step-by-step guide of what an architect does, and if you're interested in becoming an architect, hiring an architect, or simply just interested in what architects do, this video will more likely give you more information about architects and what we do from a day-to-day basis than any other video on the internet. And I can quite confidently say that because I don't think there's many people out there giving away this sort of information. So I hope you enjoyed the content, and without further ado, let's dive right into it. All right, so as you can see on this flowchart that is zoomed out to about 6% of its realistic size, there is so much work that's involved and so much work that goes into an architect's position to be able to take your project from the moment they meet you to actually moving in to whatever that might be. It may be a residential project, it may be a commercial project, but either way, there's a lot that happens in between. So starting at the very top, we are talking about the client acquisition. We're talking about the introduction between the architect and the client, be it in person, be it over Teams, over Zoom, whatever it is. It is about getting to know you, getting to know the project, and establishing those fees. So that is relatively generic, it is very simple, but even the client acquisition and the fee proposal stage of this flowchart, you can see directly here in front of me that it is a rather complicated procedure. Before we even begin drawing, there is a serious amount of work that has to go in to understanding what we're actually designing. For example, a written design document brief, as you can see over here, is a critical element of the whole design process. We have to tease out what you're looking to design before we know what we're designing. So that document is ever growing, ever evolving, and eventually becomes what you're looking for. Now, let's say we presented you with a fee proposal, you've accepted it, it's all good. We're gonna move on to sketch design. Once we move on to sketch design, the first thing we're gonna do is establish a feature survey of that site. That can come in a number of different forms. It can come from you directly, or it can come from a surveyor. That surveyor is going to provide us some digital data that we can import into our 3D software. For me personally, that is ArchiCAD, which allows us to understand the contours and the levels of the site. The site is complex. Even if it seems flat, it's definitely not flat. So what we're looking at understanding is the boundaries, the power poles, the underground services, and anything that might be an issue for us later down the track. That feature survey is always done before we even start drawing. Once we have that feature survey information, then we begin actually drawing. Not many architects still draw on paper, but there are still some out there that do a phenomenal job. So it doesn't matter what your first sketch, paper or digital, it's going to be something exquisite. The first sketch is always something that we have no idea what we're presenting to you. We don't know if that's your brief truly, if that's your budget truly, but it's a starting point. It's where we actually understand what you're looking at, what you want, and how we can move forward in that project together. Now, after we establish that sketch design, have the meeting with yourself and anybody else that's involved in that project very early on, then we can move on to design development. Design development is the second part of this project where we continue to draw. Yes, there's a lot of drawing and start, but after this design development, it gets a lot more political. Very similar to sketch design, the design development phase is really working through that architectural plan, understanding all the rooms, the spaces, the colors, the grand scheme of the architecture. We don't get into too much detail here. We're not picking any selections. We're not picking any fixtures or main colors internally. We're just focusing on the outside and the position of our walls. Now, let's say all of that was quite simple. We've mastered it. We've moved on. It becomes even more complicated if we're discussing a residential project versus a commercial project. So a residential project, for example, we'd start engaging 3 different consultants. We'd undertake a BAL assessment, which is a bushfire attack level if it's in a bushfire zone, an energy efficiency consultant, and also a structural engineer's quote. If it's commercial, on the other hand, well, things get a little bit more complicated. Let me just zoom out a little bit here for you before we break it down. This is the commercial strain that makes up all of these consultants. So once we start getting into a complex commercial project, that's where an architect real understanding of project management, contract administration, documentation, and the whole journey from start to finish of that building and the life cycle is critical. If the architect isn't experienced enough to know what happens when something is due, then the project can cause some sort of problems, some sort of delays. So if we look back into it, once again, we use those three same consultants we started with residential. They're still required in commercial, especially our structural engineer. Next, we might have an NCC consultant, which is your Australian construction standards, and they sign off on that final design. So flow pressure test is also required, soil classifications, acoustic, landscaping, planning, traffic, waste management. They are just to name a few. All of these consultants, usually the architect is in charge of if you haven't hired a specific project manager. However, architects have been doing this historically for decades, so they are very, very good at coordinating a team, and most of them have built a team that they all know and they all trust. So when you're working with an architect, you usually work with their team unless you request to specifically work with an individual. Now, the best thing about working with the architect's team is understanding that that architect has a good relationship with them. If something goes wrong, if something isn't done correctly or on time, the architect has the ability to actually draw in that consultant and get it done properly. So working with a fresh consultant, that's a lot harder. Working with existing consultant with an existing relationship becomes a much easier challenge to take on. But it's the architect's job at the same time to review all of those consultants' drawings and engage anybody further. So for instance, the NCC consultant might tell us we also need a fire engineer, which takes it a whole nother level above what we used to do before. Fire is getting more and more complex every single year because safety standards are getting higher, understandably. But it is the architect's job to coordinate all of these drawings, all of these people's information, and make sure it flows on site. So when the builder comes on site, they know what they're doing, it's all conveniently laid out, and there's no major clashes. Now, I'm not going to sit here and preach that I'm an expert and that every single drawing that I've sent out of my office is 100% correct and there's not a single clash and every single detail was 100% correct. That is near impossible to do, especially if the project is on a time-sensitive scale. Most of the time, if there isn't anything major and we've coordinated it down to the very minor details that most things can get resolved instantly on site, that is a fantastic result. However, if there is major issues, then obviously somebody hasn't done their job correctly along this process of 12 or so consultants that could be even more. So now imagine you've engaged 12 consultants, 13 including the architect. That's 13 extremely qualified professionals to bring one project to life. The architect has coordinated all of that, all of the professionals have provided their input, their guidance, and you're receiving an incredible amount of wealth and knowledge. Next, you actually have to get that documentation ready to go to a council submission and be approved by the government. This is where it gets even more complicated and even more challenging. The architect usually works with the planner quite closely here to make sure that it is approved, either directly through council or through some sort of council approved system. So here in Western Australia, for example, we have the JDAP, which is the Joint Development Approval Panel. It is basically a series of 5 professionals that review the project on its merits and approve it or deny it. It is a very strict and very complicated process, so it is not something that you want to play around with. Between sketch design and final design, architects are still drawing continuously, but a large chunk of their work, and especially my work as a lead architect, is making sure that all of these steps are done correctly, all of it is communicated correctly, all of it is coordinated correctly, and that you're kept in the loop all of the time. Now, if you're finding this video very informative, then there is a link down in the description to the davidtomic.com.au store, which will link you directly to my website that showcases a number of architectural assets. So anybody in the architecture industry, students, professionals alike, will find some great value in that store. If you're looking for some absolutely free content, if you wait 5 seconds on that site, you'll get a free ArchiCAD training session. And if you want to join an ever-growing community of architects and professionals in the industry, there is also a Discord link down below. It is 100% free. It's just a whole bunch of people from all over the world helping each other grow and making sure that the next generation of architects is even better than the last. Now, let's say everything has gone to plan. We've made it through the council, the government has approved it, we have the green light. to start documenting this project ready for construction? Well, even though we are more than 50% of the way through, it is still a very complicated procedure down the end, and this is what genuinely takes time because it is where most of the information comes from. So even though this section looks like the smallest 25%, in reality, it is a solid 40 to 50% of the project, if not more, depending on the complexity of it. So once we go into working drawings, we start to actually engage with our consultants even more. We start to break it down even more. If it's residential, we do 3 main consultants where we continue to coordinate the project. If it's commercial, it's all of the consultants I mentioned before, documented to 100% completion, ready for the builder to walk on site. We'll have multiple meetings in between with the client just to make sure we are still getting things correct and that nothing is missed along the way. There are 2 options once the documentation is completed or nearly completed. You can go directly out and start building with the builder, or you can actually tender it out through the architect. The architect will compile all the documentation and tender it out to a number of builders to try and attempt to get you the best price possible. If we are coordinating it out for a project tender and to a series of builders, that means we are coordinating a number of new documents, allowing 4 weeks for the builders to price it, continuously negotiating with the builder, understanding their requests, answering RFIs, and making sure that whatever questions or needs that they may have, we are able to communicate, answer, and distribute to everybody in that tender to keep it a fair and ethical tender. Once those tenders come back in, we sit down with the client, we have a conversation about the prices, the different builders, and the options that are available on the table. Eventually, we sit down and we select the one builder that we believe is the best one moving forward for that particular project. In that instance, we then start working with the builder, we complete the documentation 100%, and all our consultants do the exact same thing. If that's in a residential project, it isn't very many consultants. If it's in a commercial project, it is all those 13 consultants we've mentioned before, including ourselves as the architect leading the project. Residential is quite simple. Most of the time, it isn't required to go to the fire department, and you can bypass most of this 15-day waiting period, and you can jump straight to a building permit and start constructing on site. There is the optional added extra of contract administration, so the architect continues to stay onto the project even though all the drawing is done. There isn't a single line to be drawn for a very, very long time, but the architect's role now is to make sure what is drawn on that piece of paper is exactly what that builder is going to build and for the price that we originally negotiated on. Yes, sometimes there's going to be some variations, some are justifiable, some aren't. The architect's role here is to understand and be fair and reasonable in that situation to be able to say, yes, this variation is accepted. Here you go, Mr. Builder or Mrs. Builder, you can have an extra $10,000, or absolutely not, you're trying to rort the system, that variation is not going to happen. So the architect's main role here is, again, to contract administrate, to be able to provide a fair and reasonable middle person between 2 emotional parties invested financially and emotionally. The same principles apply in a commercial project. The contract administration is always available. However, there is 90% of the time a DFES or a Department of Fire and Emergency Services, which is a fire brigade, waiting period, and a commercial project can take a significantly larger amount of time to complete, up to the point where a builder can start on site compared to a residential project. So overall, if I zoom back out, that is an incredible amount of information that I've just passed on to you guys. I hope that basically outlines what an architect does to be able to get your documentation from that first initial point of contact where we meet for the first time to the very, very last second where we hand over the keys and you move in to whatever it is you're designing. Now, each one of these little bubbles has an insane amount of more work behind them. They aren't simply yes or no bubbles, but for the purposes of this, I thought that this flow chart would really be able to instill some sort of information to the general public of what an architect does, how much work goes into it, why architects are still so valuable in a world that is moving quicker and quicker every single day. Anyway, that's all from me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. That is all from me. So like always, I will see you next Monday.